It's referred to as the silent transition, which generally means you suffer in silence.
In Toil and Trouble this week, we look at menopause and its impact in the workplace. Are we ready for a cultural change? And joining me now to discuss the issue is Mary Bracken-O'Sullivan, a director at MBO Law. Well, welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
So we've got the UK Employment Rights Bill, which is otherwise known as the Menopause Bill, in its final stages. Can you talk a little bit about what this bill involves?
Yeah, sure. So if passed, it will require large employers, that's employers with 250 staff or more, to implement menopause action plans in the workplace. It's unclear what exactly that's going to involve. However, it's likely to involve flexible working options and setting out reasonable accommodations.
What about smaller employers?
Smaller employers will not have those same obligations if this legislation is passed, and that can really be compared to what's been implemented in Rhode Island, and they've introduced laws that mandate employers with 4 employees or more to implement reasonable accommodations for women experiencing menopause. So there is a difference in take in those 2 jurisdictions.
So what are sort of provisions in the bill that are relevant to menopause?
It's part of the equality legislation that's coming through, and so it's really about focusing on what employers, these large employers, can do for their employees, and that's part of this wider conversation that's an increasing recognition of women's experiences and challenges while going through menopause in the workplace.
So how big an issue is it in workplaces? Are there any sort of research around this?
Yes, there's a lot of research. There's been New Zealand-based research which found 64% of women find that their menopause does impact on their work. However, that's actually low compared to international studies which go as high as 94% of women who are experiencing menopause find some impact on their work.
So have other countries like the UK looked at legislation around this?
There have been 24 bills introduced across 15 states in the US, with Rhode Island being the first to implement law in this space. Australia has also undertaken a Senate inquiry into the issue, with the government supporting 16 of the recommendations, and at the moment they're undertaking an awareness campaign on menopause in Australia.
So that begs the question, what about New Zealand?
In New Zealand, there hasn't been a lot of work in this space. However, in saying that, when you look at the Rhode Island legislation, for example, it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations for women experiencing menopause that has an effect on their job. And the second part of that is it requires employers to engage in a good faith consultation process with employees over those reasonable accommodations. And so when you look at that law that they're introducing in Rhode Island, very different jurisdiction to New Zealand, very different political climate in the US, those legislative protections actually already exist in New Zealand. We have the good faith that underpins the employment relationship under Section 4 of the Employment Relations Act, and we also have the Human Rights Act and the Health and Safety at Work Act, which both require an employer to consider reasonable accommodations when an employee is experiencing a medical condition that impacts on their work. So it's quite interesting, the parallels there.
Do you think we need more legislation here, though, or do you think that's enough?
In the UK, there have been, prior to the Employment Rights Bill going through, there have been many cases that have looked at essentially New Zealand's equivalent of the Human Rights Review Tribunal, who have looked at menopause as a disability, so a protected grounds, and then required employers to implement reasonable adjustments, that's the legislative term there, for employees who have raised concerns about menopause. So at this stage, I would say New Zealand already has those protections in place. They just haven't yet been tested by the authority or courts.
So is that because it's still a bit of a taboo subject? Do women just not raise this issue with employers, or what's your feeling on it?
It's becoming increasingly common for women to approach their employer and ask for accommodations or support during this process. However, I would say that historically there has been stigma around it. It's referred to as the silent transition, which generally means you suffer in silence as opposed to reaching out to your employer. I'm getting a lot of queries from women saying, what is it that I can do, and how can I approach my employer on this subject. Many people don't realise that you can actually anyone can make a flexible working request to their employer, and there's only specific grounds in which they can decline that request. So I think that our legislation already does have protections for women.
But it's a case of women speaking out.
Yes, it is.
And that's a generational thing, I should imagine. My generation of women probably would have suffered in silence. That would have been something we just wouldn't have discussed with our employer. But do you think it's changing?
I think so. I think women are not feeling the stigma that previous generations may have. I think women have experienced their mothers going through this without saying anything and, felt a sense of empathy there and really not understanding where that comes from.